Hello, everyone. My name is Salma Serry. I'm your host today for this episode of our new series, Community Jameel x afikra COP28 Conversation Series, in which I am delighted to welcome Alon and Daniel, Alon Schwabe and Daniel Fernandez together, otherwise known as the Cooking Sections duo. They are a research-based artistic duo that examines the systems that organize the world through food. They are working right now on a project, CLIMAVORE X Jameel at RCA, which looks into the wetlands and drylands. The research practice traces food systems and the spaces where the climate emergency manifests through metabolic exchanges, working with the overlapping boundaries between art, architecture, ecology, and geopolitics, responding to conflicted ecologies. Established in 2013, it takes food as a lens and a tool to observe infrastructural dependencies and landscapes in transformation while activating spatial justice models and new forms of cohabitation between humans and more than humans. This episode will focus on their work on the Mediterranean and more specifically Turkey. Perhaps if you would give us an idea of what are the core problems that you see and you try to respond to in your overall practice.
For us in our work, we think a lot of these multiple ecologies that sometimes are at conflict, sometimes they are like in overlaying. That's why we use food as a tool and a lens to understand all these landscapes in transformation, but also different economic layers or different forms of governance that produce ultimately those landscapes around us.
And food has been creating many different ecologies, and it's only in the last maybe 150 200 years, right, with the process of industrialization, that this kind of idea of separating food production from nature has emerged more and more. And I think for us what is important in our practice and in the research that we are developing is to really try to find the ways of how that could be reinserted into ecological thinking, and how, in order to think about the future of our species and many other species on this planet, it's necessary to really think about how we again inhabit these different ecologies.
In Istanbul, in Turkey, we've been working on a project around wetlands as part of CLIMAVORE x Jameel at the RCA. And there, one of the kind of methodologies in the process was to understand precisely these different relationships across species or ecologies. So we were looking in particular at the production of the wetland landscape and how also multiple layers of human and non-human activity have created that space. In particular, is the project there is looking at water buffaloes and herding, and how the wetlands depend on the buffaloes, and the buffaloes depend on the wetlands and the multiple birds and frogs and grasses and bacteria that inhabit that, right? So if there is an quintessential ingredient in Turkish cuisine, like buffalo milk for desserts in kaymak, muhallebi, yogurt, that ingredient cannot be separated from an ecological balance in these wetlands that are all around the city. And that's for us a case where we've learned also through multiple conversations and studies that these dependencies are crucial for the preservation of that cultural heritage of the food, but also more importantly, the heritage, agricultural heritage or pastoralist heritage of the entire region.
I think in similar ways, also in the case of drylands, where we're focused in the south of Italy, it's trying to understand kind of the different techniques that have been used basically to live with aridity and low precipitation. Yet people have lived with aridity for like thousands of years, and what we're trying to think through basically is how we harness that knowledge that exists within communities.
That's wonderful, and specifically in how you use food as this prism to both observe, learn, watch of the the problems and the issues in our infrastructures, but also as an active tool. So how do you use it both as a way to, as a lens, as a perhaps a magnifying glass, and as a tool, as an active tool to perhaps try to rectify some faults in our systems currently?
Food becomes this intersectional tool that basically touches like every living body on this planet, and therefore it kind of really becomes something that can tell us a lot about societies and kind of cultures. We as kind of consumers and as eaters, we have a huge kind of role to play in in kind of how we are shaping the ecologies of the future of the planet. The main kind of role that we try to emphasize, that where we have to put a lot of the effort now, is kind of changing the infrastructure, right? Or how to use kind of the knowledge and kind of the influence people have to really change to hold the companies and kind of the growers and the producers kind of accountable in order to ensure that there's an ecological future to live by. Then we can all make better choices like every day. But on the other hand, I think if we think of food as a human right, you know, the access to good food, it is something that it's governments and kind of growers and farmers and corporations that need to provide it to all of society.
How do you see the role of art and design and architecture um, in trying to have a conversation with the climate issues?
There are many causes and many consequences of all these different actions, industrial processes, disruptions in the supply chain, climatic events. And so we think that it's sometimes useful to use all these different disciplines, from visual arts to architecture to botany to marine ecology, and collaborate with the different experts that have knowledge in those different fields to try to approximate ourselves to new scenarios or future alternatives that could perhaps try out or test iterations of other forms of infrastructure.
This takes me to something that I've been thinking quite a lot about. When you mentioned this divide between the rural and the urban, I actually go back to this idea of spatial injustice that you work on. And I'm reminded of the idea of sovereignty in general. And how do you see perhaps these terms connected or manifesting in what you do?
If it's like the project around Buffalo Commons in the outskirts of Istanbul, that has been basically the land on which kind of the buffaloes have been herding and grazing is kind of being encroached, right? So what we see is the disappearance of an activity that, like, we're seeing the disappearance of a certain ecological landscape that is basically this, what it's kind of encroaching on is a complete way of life, right? That in turn kind of manifest in the disappearance of a quintessential food. So I think in that sense, these things are always kind of inseparable. And it's really important, I think, today, exactly kind of to advocate, right? To the question of sovereignty goes far beyond kind of just the land itself and kind of what, like, access to it. And we have to kind of reinforce this idea of culture within agriculture, something that has been kind of so inherent but has been disappearing over the past decades.
And looking back at the traditional, looking back at the culture, looking back at the roots. And so how does your work in terms of the knowledge it produces, how much of the past does it look at? But also, incorporates the technology, new innovations. Even though I believe what you're doing in itself is innovation, So I'd love to hear how you conceptualize that.
I think for us, we kind of really work at the intersection of this kind of thinking about the future and the past, and how the future can be informed by this knowledge. In the case of the project in southern Italy, it's this idea of drought is not new, nor to the land, nor to the people. And there's a whole knowledge that has been developed over centuries to kind of cope and adapt kind of different species and different crops to deal with water scarcity and drought. So how can we kind of take this knowledge, right, and kind of bring it forward, or kind of situate it in the kind of conditions that we are working with today?
How can we reconceptualize our approach to food?
Very basically is to reconnect that culture with agriculture, because it was always the case that agriculture was culture.
To conclude with COP28 coming up in December in Dubai, what are your expectations for it?
What we need is exactly the people that are on the ground, the farmers that are pursuing agroecological ways of growing food, and that are the stewardess, and the people that are taking care of the land, to lead not only the conversation, but to lead the action.
Thank you so much, Alon and Daniel. This has been an absolute pleasure having you and talking to you about these all these pertinent questions and issues. And I look forward to hear more about your work in the future, and staying connected with what you do. It's all fabulous work. And thank you so much, everyone, for listening. This was Salma Serry with Cooking Sections, Alon and Daniel, and their work, their project CLIMAVORE X Jameel at RCA. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Salma.